but I came prepared with Mel various questions. So we're going to work our way through this. The first question that Mel asked about is, considering the Muslim Brotherhood's seditious, subversive mission statement, give me an estimate on how much they've accomplished towards their hegemonic goals. Well, they've accomplished a lot, an enormous amount. And it's do it under Republicans, they do it under Democrats. So the Muslim Brotherhood has an outstanding attribute, which is long-range planning and the will to win. They may be outnumbered 100 to 1, but they're going to win. That's what they're going to do. Let me give you an example of their long-range planning. It was 25 years ago that the Muslim Brotherhood convened a meeting about taking over the textbooks in America so that they would become completely Sharia compliant. It took them 25 years to do that, but they've done it. They're the same with everything. They're relentless and they have incredible long-range planning. I just told you that. They're also quick to adapt. For instance, after 9/11, it was only 3 days later that the phones began to ring at churches across the nation saying, "We are Muslims and we want to come to your church and talk to you about Islam, the peaceful religion." So the speed, in 3 days' time after 9/11, they had a national plan going. These people are incredible. Here in Tennessee, we know that the American Muslim Advisory Council, a Muslim Brotherhood organization, is the only organization that a Republican governor will let teach law enforcement about what they call terrorism, which is jihad. I can't do it. They won't even return my phone calls. Actually, I wouldn't even try to give them a phone call because I know what they'd do. So they're really good and they're well funded. Muslims believe in funding jihad. I sat in a mosque in Southern California while a man came in and gave a pitch on raising money for lawfare, that is suing people like me, and then when we finally get ready to go to trial, drop the suit. He raised nearly $20,000 from a group of about 50 people, and they did it in 20 minutes. Try doing that at any other social group or church. It's a little difficult to do. But they're commanded by the Quran to give money to jihad, and they give it. So the Muslim Brotherhood is well funded. For instance, here in Nashville, Tennessee, I work out of my home. But the Muslim Brotherhood representative, Paul Galloway, his middle name is Isa, which is the Quranic Jesus, he has an office. He has a receptionist. He has a secretary. He has all the funds he needs. This is the Muslim Brotherhood. And I'm one of their biggest admirers. Now, I despise them, but I admire them because they are so good. All right, what's our next question here? Oh, there was a Clarion Project video narrated by a female Muslim. Her last name is Raza. And there are some questions that Mel asked about the difference between Islamists, radicals, fundamentalists, and what the difference between these are. I don't make any difference between any of them. I ask a more fundamental question. How much of the jihad doctrine do they implement, and how do they implement it? Now, what about the nature of this lady? I saw the video. She appears to be Persian, and the name is as well. And what does she think or feel? I have no idea. And what difference does it make? She strikes me as a sincere person. Somehow or other, she strikes me as more sincere than Zuhdi Jasser, who's another well-known, quote, moderate Muslim. One of the things you need to ask yourself, the question is, where do these moderates, what's their audience? Zuhdi Jasser, yes, is that his name? Anyway, whatever. Usually presents his message not to Muslims, no, to Kafirs. So that's one of the questions you want to ask these so-called reformists is, what audience do they step in front of? Because if they're really sincere about reforming Islam, don't come to the Kafir, go to the Muslims. But the ones who want the reform is not the Muslims, they want the Kafir is the one who wants the reform. So I have no idea what her heart is, and I don't make any distinction between the fundamentalists, all of those things. I just ask, how much of the Sharia, how much of Islam do they want? Next question, is the proposed Thomas More lawsuit opposing refugee resettlement in Tennessee a worthwhile effort? Explain. I think it's worthwhile. I think we should fight on all fronts. About 10 years ago, a politician that I knew was in England, and he said, if you could change one thing about what Islam, what would it be? He said, immigration. So anything that will oppose immigration, I say we try. And besides that, the choice is either the lawsuit or nothing, to my knowledge. Next question, what are the best action that senior citizens who seem to understand the seriousness of the Islamic threat better than younger generations can help those stopping the threat of Islam? Well, here's an interesting viewpoint. Remember, I just told you I go to Europe a lot. You know what? In Europe, I'm the oldest man in the room. In America, I'm a normal man in the room. I'll say that of the people that I see in Europe, 90% of them are under the age of 35, which is very different from America, because as my granddaughter said when she saw a picture of a Tea Party, she says, it's a gray army. So what we need to do in talking with the youth is simple. If it's a church, you need to educate the youth how to prevent from being converted to Islam. That's another whole issue and another talk. But another thing is to point out to the youth what the true nature of political Islam and the Sharia means, so that the youth can see that they have just as much to lose as the old conservatives. And it's the same with the liberals. I had an email today complaining that the politicization between conservative and liberal extended into Islam. And he says Islam doesn't support a single liberal principle, and it does not. Bill Maher has been very good in pointing this out. But the young have their own ideals, and we need to talk to the young about how Islam will crush their ideals. Are there actually moderate Muslims, or are they just Muslims sitting on the sidelines waiting for the right time to support the takeover? Well, the bad news is that most Muslims are like most Christians. It's a social thing, it's a convenient thing, and it provides some support for some issues in life, particularly transitions, illness, and death. But my talking with Muslims is most of them know very little about Islam. And I say the same thing about Christians as well. And are they moderate or sitting on the fence? No way of knowing. You know, my thing is to deal with Muslims as human beings and then just ask them questions about what is the part of Islam they understand and like the best. Will Islamic threat ever cause white, black, Hispanic, and Asian Americans to band together? Great idea. Now then, the biggest inroads, however, are being made in the black community. Muslims go to blacks and they say, Islam is the religion for the black man. Christianity is the religion of the white man. Well, you know, that's really interesting, because Muhammad was a slaveholder, and he is described in the Hadith as being white. I once was approached by a man who dealt with prison ministries, and he wanted me to inform him on how he could oppose conversion of inmates. I said, it's a real simple thing. Teach the inmates who are predominantly black converting the true story of slavery and Islam and the true story of Muhammad as a slave owner. Muhammad stood by and prayed while black slaves were being beaten. These stories need to be told. So we need to understand here that the minorities don't have any better life under Islam than the majorities do. And in particular, the issue of slavery is sensitive in the black community. Islam has an incredible propaganda machine. How can this be neutralized? Remember, we have a near enemy and we have a far enemy. Forget about the far enemy, which is Islam. Islam knows that what you do is you talk to the people and convert them to being the near enemy, and that they now support Islam. So you don't want to go knocking on the door of a Muslim. What you want to do is you want to go knocking on the door of those who support Islam. Ministers, newspaper editors, teachers, professors, wherever you find them, they're the ones to be attacked. And in each case, you want to explain to them what Islam means to them. For instance, Jews. The majority of Jews, I think roughly 80%, vote liberal, or some version of that. But a liberal Jew has two things that he needs to consider about Islam. What does Islam mean for liberal principles? For instance, feminism. What does Islam mean for that? Well, Islam does not very good on that issue, is it? And how is Islam with regards to the issue of Jews? You need to be able to talk to a Jew and explain to them that there's more Jew hatred in the Quran, the Sirah, and the Hadith than there is in the Mein Kampf. So with each of these near enemies, we need to go to them and explain to them what's happening. I know that teachers who say, well, you know, whatever about teaching the material that's in the textbooks. You need to educate the teachers in your community. Because what has happened is that people from Sevierville go off to college and get educated, and they may leave a conservative Christian from Sevierville, but by the time they get through the education program, they're pretty much on their way to teaching nothing but liberal values and political correctness. Okay. Will an effort similar to the Crusades be necessary as the ultimate step for halting the devastating destruction of societies worldwide with the invasion of Muslims? Will there be a world leader willing to lead that effort, and who do I see as the leader? I don't see anybody as the leader. When I'm in Europe, it strikes me as it's not a lot different from America. They have a government at the top, in this case the EU, which doesn't seem to respond to any guidance from anybody, has its own agenda, and is all for the Islamification of America. So, will we need something like the Crusades? We don't need anything like the Crusades at all if we will take advantage of doing arguments now based on the facts of Islam. This is an ideological war. We don't need bullets, we don't need bombs. What we need are people who are willing to stand up. That's the thing about Muslims that I like. They will stand up. I'll go to a meeting and everyone in the room is a conservative or a Christian, and 1 or 2 Muslims will show up. Find me that number of Christians or conservatives who will go to an all-Islamic meeting. I'm not aware of any that will do that. So, courage is what it takes. It takes more than grumbling. I tell you, emails are a wonderful thing, and I'll largely run my life out of my email inbox. But let me tell you something, another email is not going to save this civilization. And that's another thing we need to understand, is this is a civilizational war. Never let anybody persuade you that this is a, quote, holy war or a religious war. It has to do with our civilization. And by the way, if there ever were a Christian Brotherhood, it would learn to address the Christian message not to salvation, but instead to civilization. Because it turns out that Christianity is a wonderful basis for even an atheist to exist in a civilization. I did a talk in which a liberal, I think he was also homosexual, gave a talk on why Islam is a dreadful religion for even an atheist to exist in. So he said, people say all religions are the same. He said, that's crazy. He said, they're not all the same. He said, I don't believe in anything in the Bible of the Christian, but I believe in everything that the Christian advocates for a government. So we need to emphasize civilizational principles. We don't want to make this a conversion process unless you're dealing with a Muslim and then you convert that guy. That is the final solution for that. Let me put in one word here. When people ask questions like this, what they have in mind is some form of war. I've studied war for a lot in my life, and one of the things that we learned about war is it is non-linear. Remember, at the end of December 7th on 1941, the Japanese were winning the war in the Pacific. But in the end, it didn't work out that way, did it? No, because we finally went to war. If we would ever go to war, if we would make Islam a political issue in every election for every office, we could start winning. There's this change happening here in America. There are becoming more and more people who are willing to admit that, you know, there's a problem. Bill Maher has done more for the advancement, and he's a self-stated liberal. If you ever get a chance to see any of his YouTube videos about Islam, go to him and watch them. He says, look, they call me a bigot, they call me a hater. And by the way, I've been called all kinds of names. Let me mention this because this is one reason that some people don't want to stand up against Islam. They don't want to go to church and have somebody say, oh, he's one of them, one of those haters and bigots. If you get in this game, you're going to be called a hater and a bigot. Get over it. The first time it's like, what do you mean I'm a bigot? I'm not of that. Never argue with them. I've been called the worst names you can think of, and I never argue against it. I always move the point to Islam. I never deal with insults. And what's happened is, over time is that I now get fewer insults. It's kind of like Donald Trump, isn't it? They jump on his case, and what you're supposed to do on political correctness, oh, well, I didn't mean to be a bigot. Oh, I apologize. Oh, I'm so sorry. Forgive me, forgive me. Nah, I don't deal with that stuff. It's an ignorant person who would call me a racist anyway. So why deal with ignorance? What I want to deal with is the question of Islam. And if you think I'm a bigot because of that, you're the one with the problem, because no liberal progressive principle or leftist principle is supported by Islam. Not one. With all the turmoil in Europe, how does the general public react to the current problems and potential future problems? Well, I told you I spend 3 to 4 weeks, I'm spending 3 weeks, and now they want me to move it to 4 weeks, touring Europe. But the part of Europe I tour in is a very different part of Europe than you think of. I was raised in America, and I think of Europe as being France, Germany, Italy, maybe Scandinavia, certainly England and Ireland. But I have in my trips to Europe been introduced to another Europe, Central Europe and Eastern Europe, Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Romania, and it's a very different world there. Let me give you an example. I'll give you 2 examples. The first one is that I am not allowed to speak in any university or college here in America. I just can't get the invites. Remember, I'm a bigot and a hater, and I'm not politically correct, and colleges don't like politically incorrect people. I got to give a talk to 800 young students at a Christian college and got 2 standing ovations. That doesn't happen here in America. Why is it happening in Budapest, Hungary? Because you see, Hungary has 2 legacies. Number one, they were under the rule of the Ottoman Empire, Muslim Empire, for 150 years. They remember that. They hated it. So they don't want the next invasion. The other thing is they also have been under the boot heel of the Soviets. And in Central Europe and Eastern Europe, they look at the Soviets, they look at the Muslims as being Soviets with a god, or a communism with a god. And they've already experienced one of those people who want to tell you how to run your life, and they don't want another one at all. So as a consequence, there are 2 kinds of responses in Europe. There is the Central Europe, and by the way, the European Union despises Hungary, Czech, and Poland. Here's an example of what happened in Hungary. 3,000 Syrian refugees showed up at the train station. The government announced that they would receive water and outhouses. That was it. No food, no blankets, no tents. They said, you need to move along. Well, 3 days later, the 3,000 Syrian refugees moved along to Germany, where they got everything they wanted, including free medical care, free this, free that. And if you rape a German woman, nobody cares. There's been a massive outbreak of rape with these, quote, refugees, but the governments are just saying, well, our women need to cover up better, and they need to avoid certain parts of town. Well, that's a big difference from what it is in Central Europe. They don't want them there in the first place. By the way, I'm going to do a video about the feminist liberal response to the rape plague in Europe, because this is truly one of the most disgusting things that you can find. But you know what they did in Sweden that solved this problem? There's no more Islamic rape in Sweden. You know why? The police are not allowed to ask any questions that would lead to a conclusion that you're an Arab, a North African, or a Muslim. See? Problem solved. So there are different Europes. But now what is also happening even in the Western Europe is that there's a new movement amongst the young called identity movement. Because you see, the EU and the Muslims have the same thing to say. Oh, we need a multicultural world. We don't want a European culture. Just like in Denmark, the government now says, if you're proud of being a Dane, that's a form of racism. While we all just need to be globalists, that's what we need to be. Well, there are a lot of young people looking going, globalism my foot. I want to be a Frenchman. I want to be a Dane. I want to be an Italian. I don't want to be a global citizen. So there's beginning to be pushback in Western Europe, and that pushback has already started. Oh, by the way, another interesting thing in Central Europe, I get invited to do questions on state television. I did a half-hour in Slovakia. I did a half-hour in Czech Republic. I did a 1.5-hour program in Budapest, and then a second 10-minute program in Budapest. These are on state-run programs. So one of the differences between Europe and America is, in America, I'm treated as a man of some dignity and knowledge, whereas in Europe, I'm treated as a man of dignity and knowledge, and I'm, as much as possible, pushed away from any form of government. Whereas in Europe, I'm invited, I speak with cabinet members, I speak with advisors, foreign policy advisors. I spend an hour and a half at lunch with an intelligence head. So in Europe, things are very different. Now this is kind of a piece of good news, because Europe is about 15 years ahead of us. So if Europeans are beginning to say, we want to be Europeans, we don't want to be globalist, we can see the same thing beginning to happen here in America. Is there How do they react? Oh, how do they react to Muslims insisting on Sharia law? I presume, let me go back here, this question 10. Who is the they in this? In Europe. Well, I can tell you this, they're becoming more and more aware of what the Sharia is. Oh, by the way, we had an interesting thing happen. My book, Sharia Law for Non-Muslims, is now #1 on the Islamic Law Department at Amazon. Yay! We have, my book, Sharia Law for Non-Muslims, has been translated into 20 languages. When I was in Budapest, the woman who interviewed me on television came in and we sat down and she says, now I'm going to ask you some very tough questions. Go ahead. Well, they weren't tough questions. But when we got through, we handed her a Sharia Law for Non-Muslims just translated into Hungarian. She said, oh, can I have your signature? She was all excited. She went from being, I'm going to be tough, to like, will you sign my autograph, my book? 3 days later, on Budapest television, a man was standing up who was identified as the former head of intelligence for Hungary, had the book Sharia Law for Non-Muslims in Hungarian and said, every Hungarian must read this. So what we're seeing is that Europe is beginning to be interested in what is the nature of the poison that's being shoved down their throats. Is there any action to prevent Sharia from becoming law? Yes, there is. Educate people as to what Sharia means. The first thing you want to tell them is Sharia law is not about law in the sense you think about it. When we think of law, we think of a judge with a gavel, probably a black robe on, law books in the background, you know, the usual what we think of for law in courts, what you see on Law and Order or something like that. Well, you see, the worst part about Sharia is it's much more than law. There are rules for a civilization. So once the people begin to see what the true nature of the Sharia is, then they will say, I don't want that. Why, it says that I'm a kafir, and a kafir's filthy scum. Why would I want any system of law that says that I'm scum? So the way to battle Sharia is with education. And by the way, Sharia education should be a part of every church. Every church needs to understand that there's a special place in Islam for Christians, a very special place. They're called dhimmis, D-H-I-M-M-I-S, dhimmis. And they're subjugated. And by the way, one of the interesting things about being a dhimmi under the Sharia is that it's different from being a slave. A slave is property. A dhimmi is not property, but the dhimmi must be humiliated. Now, you don't humiliate slaves, but the dhimmi is called upon to be humiliated. That's the reason in Islamic countries, little boys will throw rocks at dhimmis, because they're supposed to humiliate them. The actual, and this comes from a Quran verse which says that the people of the book are to be subjugated until they admit to the truth of the Sharia, and then they are to pay the jizya, the special tax, and then they are to be humiliated, denigrated, and ground down. It's this element of the Sharia that causes conversion of Christians into Islam. Because once the Islam, and by the way, what we see in the Middle East now is not so much the real Sharia until we've had the oncoming of Al-Qaeda and Islamic State. You see, the colonization process took away a lot of the Sharia terms. For instance, Jews say, you know, we had it pretty good under Islam in the Middle East. Well, they're only telling half the story, but part of the reason for that is the dhimmi status was destroyed by the colonialist. So the way to stop Sharia is to educate people about Sharia. Training sites in Tennessee, what about them? I don't keep up with training sites at all. What happened is that they were an attempt by the Muslim Brotherhood and other jihadi types to set up enclaves. Well, what do you think happened as soon as the little movie was made about them? Well, they cleaned up their act. They invited the sheriff in to see, well, look and see what we have here. So I don't pay a lot of attention to training camps, and the reason for that is this. The least troublesome thing about Islam is jihad with the sword. If it were not for jihad with a sword, we wouldn't stand a chance of saving our nation, because it's the jihad with money, the jihad with speech, and the jihad with writing that's taking us down the road to hell. The jihad of the sword actually fires people up, but the jihad of the speech, in which the smooth Muslim Brotherhood type goes in and talks with the Methodist minister or whatever other minister and explains how Muslims have been abused and how there's just not a clear understanding of how Christians and Muslims are really one branch of the same tree, or two branches of the same tree, or something like that. So that form of jihad is far more ruinous than jihad of the sword. Now, I'm not diminishing the jihad of the sword because of what happens to the individuals in it or their families, but I'm just saying that we lost 3,000 people on 9/11. We've lost more than 3,000 people in the wars in Iraq and Iran and Afghanistan. So the loss of bodies does not destroy a civilization. What causes a civilization to be destroyed is when the children are taught in school that Islam is the best religion in the world. See, that starts destroying a civilization. When they're told that the Sharia is a wonderful thing, when they're told that Islam was the first one to give women their rights, when they're told that the highest point of all human civilization was the Baghdad Golden Age, that is what destroys a civilization, because it brings in lies into the public discussion. So, do you see my point here? Is that civilizational damage is when our laws are changed so that refugees can come in. And who picks our refugees? Well, the United Nations does. But we're the one who signed on to the Muslim Brotherhood's operation inside of the United Nations. We said, oh, we'll let the Muslim Brotherhood and the United Nations run our immigration policy. How many mosques are there now in Tennessee? I don't know. Don't really care. That sounds like an odd thing to say, doesn't it? But that's not an index I keep up with. By the way, here's proof and power of the Muslim Brotherhood. This question is formed in terms of mosques. But what we need to understand is that a long time ago, about 20 to 30 years, the Muslim Brotherhood decided that they wouldn't build more mosques in America. What they would do is they would build Islamic centers. Now, why are they doing this? Because you see it in an Islamic center, you have a movie theater, you have a bowling alley, you have a swimming pool. See, they have their own problems. And one of the problems is they come to America and the Sharia is not everywhere. So therefore it's possible to cheat on a lot of the Sharia rules. And then people drift away from Islam. So what they want is an Islamic center is to bring everybody in to the community center. And so therefore the question is how many Islamic centers are being built is more important than how many mosques are being built. Another reason it's hard to keep up with mosques is just like the storefront churches, there are storefront mosques, informal groups, and so it's kind of hard to track them and keep up with them. One of the things you do want to keep up with is who pays the money for the mosque. He who pays the piper calls the tune. 80% of the mosques being built in the United States are being built by the Saudis, Obama's best friend in the Middle East. Or is it Iran? I don't remember anymore. What we need to do is not so much watch the Muslims. I'm coming back to this same issue. We need to watch the apologists for Islam. Those are the ones we need to keep up with. Notice something very clever about how the Muslim Brotherhood works. Does the Muslim Brotherhood print the new textbooks? No. Does the Muslim Brotherhood edit the new textbooks? Well, a little bit there they do. What they've done is they've bought the textbook companies. They have entered into them, for instance, one of the textbook company, Pearson, has an imam on staff. Now see, that's a ruinous position right there, but there's no Christians on staff. You say, oh, well, there are Christians who work at Pearson. A Muslim Brotherhood representative is very different from a Christian working there, because the Christian never stands up and says, we need to teach this in the textbooks. They just complain about it after the textbooks are printed. We believe Sevier County is somewhat prepared, or so says the sheriff. Well, prepared for what? A big bomb going off? They probably are. The jihad of the sword is the easiest thing to deal with. They burn a building, you call out the fire department. There's a bomb goes off, well, there are people who know bombs. So when it comes to jihad of the sword and the gun, that's not what I'm worried about. What I'm worried about is the sheriff has nothing to do with the fact that the books being bought for the new library are pro-Islam. He doesn't have anything to say about that. You need to ask the sheriff if he's actually had any training by people like John Guandolo, because if all of his training comes from the FBI and the TBI, then he's not getting much of a training anyway. My friend John Guandolo says he loves to do this in his law enforcement trainings. In the opening 30 minutes, he gives a list of everything they're going to learn and everything that's happening. Now, he said, I want you to raise your hand if you're in this audience and you've heard of any of this before from Homeland Security or FBI or anything else. A hand is never raised. He says, now then, how well educated are you really? Because this is just what we're going to cover today. So I don't know the sheriff. He's probably a good man, but he's probably not nearly prepared for Sharia. And if he's only had the training that comes from our government, well, just imagine that Obama's teaching your children or your law enforcement. Go from there. How prepared are the other states? I don't have no idea. You see, there's an experiment going on here which has never been done before in humanity, and that experiment is this. Heretofore, all knowledge about Islam was either inside of the imam or inside of a specialist in a university. The common man has never known anything about Islam. So the purpose of CSPI, the Center for the Study of Political Islam, is to educate the common man as to what Sharia is and what Islam is. Because inevitably, once people find out the true nature of Islam, they go, I don't think I want any of that, thank you, and I don't want my next door neighbor having any either. So it is an ideological war, and CSPI International is for fighting an ideological war.